Welcome to the Lyceum Institute Colloquium series. These colloquia, comprising a pre-recorded lecture and live question and answer session, invite respected academics and intellectuals to challenge our thinking with their expertise and insights. Today's lecture is provided by one of our own members, Dr. Michel Accad, a physician and amateur but well-studied and insightful philosopher. In this lecture and in the accompanying papers, Dr. Accad raises the question of brain death as a criterion for determining whether a human is living, and by the use of Aristotelian hylomorphic principles, shows that there are problems with this notion.
Hello, friends of the Lyceum. Thank you for joining me. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about brain death. It's a topic that is very dear to my heart. It's obviously a very important topic. It's a very vast topic. I'm amazed at how little conversation there is on this question in society when it's such a fundamental topic. But it's been essentially pushed to the side, at least so far, and now it only occupies the interest of a few philosophers and ethicists publishing in obscure journals. But we're going to talk about brain death today. This colloquium is a little bit different. Obviously, you have a paper, my paper to read. Perhaps, I don't know if Dr. Campbell also provided you with the rebuttals to my paper, the back and forth. So you'll have some papers to read. If you have not read the papers yet, I think that's okay. You can listen to this talk here and then go back to, and read the paper. But either way, I think you'll be fine if you've read the papers or not, because my plan here is to do three things. I'm going to first give you a little bit more of the historical background of the problem of brain death, and then bring you up to date as to where the debate stands right now among philosophers, but perhaps also particularly among Catholic philosophers. That's one thing I will do. The second thing I will do is maybe hone in on one particular argument that I really struggled with as I was studying this, as I was writing this paper, or as I was trying to come to a resolution myself on this question of brain death. And I think it's a very important point of metaphysics, of natural philosophy, that if we get it right, then I think we understand act and potency very, very well, and it's easy to get tripped up by that point. At least, I think it is, and I think I get it right, and I think that other philosophers, including very well qualified Thomistic natural philosophers, get wrong. So of course, I'm not, you're free to disagree with me, and if you have disagreements with my reasoning, we can talk about it. But I have to say from the outset here that some very prominent Thomistic philosophers have argued the opposite point. They've argued in favor of brain death, and I think they make this particular mistake in hylomorphic reasoning. And I think so. I'll talk about that. It's in the paper, but I'll flesh it out a little bit more. And then the last thing I will talk about is something that is also neglected in the debate. People say, so the point is, yes, I mean, my point is that the neurological criteria for the determination of death are faulty. I mean, are not just faulty, but they should not be. They should not be a brain criterion to determine death. And I explain why there should be a cardiac criterion for determining death is correct. That the absence of a pulse is a legitimate criterion to determine that a body is dead, whereas a brain criterion is illegitimate. And very few people, even the people who are on my side of the debate, nobody has brought up that point. People have made very good arguments against brain death, but nobody has made a good, as far as I can tell, a good philosophical argument to retain the cardiac criterion for determining death, apart from St. Thomas Aquinas himself 800 years ago. All right, so to get started with a historical background, let me tell you a little bit. I want to start first by mentioning a question that is adjacent to the problem of brain death, but that is frequently mixed in with it. And that question is the question of whether it is morally licit or illicit to keep people on ventilators, beyond a certain time. The question of what now in Catholic moral theology is frequently referred to as the question of the teaching about proportionate and disproportionate care. So you may be aware or not be aware that there is a doctrine in the Catholic Church that it's okay to withhold care or not. I mean, the point is that we don't have to do everything humanly possible to save somebody's life, right? There can be a point where it's okay to say, enough is enough, and let that person go if a person is, has a severe illness or a severe injury, and that decision can be made by the person themselves, or if they're not conscious, it can be made by whoever is responsible for that person. So that's the doctrine. It used to be called in the mid-20th century, it used to be called the doctrine of ordinary and extraordinary means of conserving life. And now the term that are used more commonly are proportionate and disproportionate means of conserving life, or the doctrine of proportionate and disproportionate care. And it was not a very, for obvious reason, up until the mid-20th century, it was not a very big part of moral theology, for the simple fact that when people were severely ill, people either recovered from their illnesses or they died. But with the advent of medical technology, starting in the 20th century, maybe late 19th century, and certainly by the mid-20th century, we've developed means of keeping patients alive longer than we could have in the past, and long enough to the point where the question poses itself. Should we keep that person going, or is it okay to withdraw life support? And Pope Pius XII made a statement in the 1950s clarifying for the flock that it's important to, life is a gift of God, and it's a great gift, and we should do what we can to preserve it. But we're not morally obligated to do everything humanly possible to maintain somebody alive, and that it's under certain circumstances it may be okay to let somebody go. And extraordinary means that are either too burdensome or too he doesn't spell them out. I don't think he didn't spell them out in his address. But there are reasons that can be invoked as to why it's okay to let a person go, not to actively kill that person, but to let that person go. And so I wanted to make that point because that notion frequently gets sneaked into the question of brain death, as we will see in a moment. All right, so having said that, now let me talk about brain death itself. Again, the concept of brain death didn't emerge until we had the technology to maintain human bodies, human persons alive long enough, even though in a state of deep deep unconsciousness, essentially a state of coma due to severe brain damage. And this came about with the advent of the ventilator, right? Because since the brain to some extent controls the respiratory muscles and controls the work of breathing, that work of breathing can be artificially maintained by a mechanical ventilator, even if the brain is not functioning, and therefore the brain itself cannot order, so to speak, the diaphragm and the respiratory muscles to move in order to expand the lungs. So when the ventilator came online, so to speak, in the 1950s, physicians were confronted with this problem, not this problem, but let's say this new situation of having patients with very severe and maybe irreversibly severe, or with irreversible brain damage that could be kept on a ventilator, and then the question is, what do we do again? Are we morally obligated to keep them alive and so forth? So that's one aspect of the background. The second aspect of the background is that at around the same time, medical technology also came about to make possible organ transplantation. Initially, organ transplantation from cadavers, but later on, the prospect of having living donors was becoming clear, and was seen as by the medical profession, at least some in the medical profession, as potentially desirable, and particularly these same patients with irreversible brain damage who were comatose without any hope of regaining consciousness started to be viewed as a potential source of organs, but there had to be a justification, right? A moral justification to use those patients who up until then would be considered alive, right? So long as they had a heartbeat and sort of were obviously otherwise showing signs of life, there would have to be a justification to take their organs, particularly their hearts, because in the process of doing so, then obviously you bring about death. And that's when the concept of brain death was essentially engineered. I would say it was engineered by ethicists, by neurologists, by transplant physicians, probably simultaneously in various parts of the world, but most prominently at Harvard, because from Harvard, a landmark paper, a very short paper, was published in 1968, in which the physicians who wrote, the ethicists and physicians and transplant physicians and neurologists who wrote the paper, essentially proposed that we declare these patients with irreversible coma, that we declare them as dead. And I'm going to read you the first paragraph of this paper just because it's quite instructive to read it. Again, it was published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, August 5th, 1968. And here's the first paragraph. Our primary purpose is to define irreversible coma as a new criterion for death. There are two reasons why there is a need for a definition. 1. Improvements in resuscitative and supportive measures have led to increased efforts to save those who are desperately injured. Sometimes these efforts have only partial success, so that the result is an individual whose heart continues to beat, but whose brain is irreversibly damaged. The burden is great on patients who suffer permanent loss of intellect, on their families, on the hospitals, and on those in need of hospital beds already occupied by these comatose patients. And number 2, obsolete criteria for the definition of death can lead to controversy in obtaining organs for transplantation. Okay, so that's the first paragraph, and it sets the tone for what the intent of the paper is. In the rest of the paper, they say they describe what they mean by irreversible coma by giving a set of criteria that can be ascertained at the bedside. These are the so-called neurological criteria. For example, if you have a patient who's unresponsive and they don't have any pupillary reflex. They don't have any. They have a flat electroencephalogram, a flat EEG. They don't show any signs of spontaneous respiration. If you turn off the ventilator for, let's say, a minute or two, and they don't take a breath, then that's another sign that there's, brain damage and so forth. So it's essentially a neurological examination, a formal neurological examination, to fulfill certain criteria, the so-called neurological criteria, by which one would then be allowed to call a patient that was until then called a patient in a coma, to call that person dead, or that body, to call that body dead and not alive. And once you call that body dead, then all the problems are solved. You don't have to tell the families that there's a need to keep them, that turning off the ventilator is withholding care, because there's no care to be withheld. It's just a cadaver, right? There's no you can dispense of all the issues surrounding what to do with this patient, including any moral issue about what to do about the organs, because the organs now are taken from a cadaver. They're no longer taken from a person who's alive, and therefore the procedure of taking the organs does not kill the body, since the body has been declared dead already. So that was the proposal by the Harvard people. I must say that it was greeted with very little controversy, and maybe by some relief from the medical profession as a whole, not universally, but as a whole, because most doctors, then and now, tend to be very kind of mechanistic and utilitarian in their ethics, and that seemed like a pretty good thing to do. However, there was a legal problem with this, in that in most states, the legal definition of death had to do with the absence of vital signs, the absence of a pulse, and the absence of breathing, right? And there was at least there had been many legal cases. In fact, some of these legal cases are mentioned in this paper. Many controversial legal cases where you have people who are essentially in this situation of irreversible coma, where there's the doctors decide to declare them dead, and then it goes to court, and the juries and the courts and the judges don't know what to do, and there's a lot of confusion as to who's in charge in making the determination of death. So in the aftermath of this paper, there was a lot of work by lawyers, but mainly by philosophers and ethicists and physicians, to come up with a rationale, as a philosophical rationale, to accept those criteria of those neurological criteria to determine that these people are dead. So that it wouldn't seem like it's a declaration of death by fiat, but that it would seem sort of a legitimate, philosophically sound or scientifically well-reasoned proposal, and not just a proposal. That the declaration of death would actually be a statement of fact, a statement of reality. So that procedure, that the discussions that ensued, the lots of publications that followed, included the support of prominent Catholic moral philosophers, including Germain Griset, who, as some of you may know, he passed away maybe 2-3 years ago, was a prominent pro-life in terms of on the question of abortion, a pro-life philosopher, and he ended up publishing some papers agreeing to the idea that human bodies who don't have a functioning brain, whose brain is irreversibly damaged, are actually dead, are truly dead. and his argument gained a lot of prominence because it was important for the country as a whole if it was going to change its legal statutes, that there be sort of buy-in from the Catholic community into this concept of brain death. And so Griset and his colleagues in the part of the new natural law theory movement. I don't know if some of you know about the Griset and the new natural law theorists, but they're, as far as I'm concerned, they're pseudo-Thomists. It's a Thomistic heresy. They managed to speak for the Catholic community, and in 1981 or 82, there was a big document that was issued by a presidential ethical committee that essentially ended up agreeing that there is a good reason to call brain dead bodies as dead, to call them dead. And that argument was essentially the argument that was advanced was what we now call the argument from integration. And the argument was that the brain functioned as the integrator of the body, right? It's the organ that keeps a body integrated, and without a brain, a body is disintegrated, and therefore it makes perfect sense to call brain dead patients dead, because it's a statement of fact. It's not by fiat. It's not a choice. That argument continues to have some hold among philosophers and ethicists, and to defend it. And a good chunk of my paper is to demonstrate that it's not a valid argument, that the argument from integration is not valid because, simply put, a part cannot integrate a whole. And then I bring to bear, Thomistic principles of hylomorphism as to why that is the case, that it cannot be. You cannot have a part integrate a whole, at least not a material, not a physical part integrate a whole. And the only thing that integrates a whole is the first act of the body, which is for living bodies is the soul. Now, part of the argument of integration, this brain death argument from the view that the brain is the integrator of the body, was that these brain dead bodies are actually cadavers, but the reason they don't behave like cadavers is because the decomposition of the body is masked, at least temporarily, masked by the life support, by the ventilator and whatnot. That the intensive care is masking the actual process of decomposition that is actually taking place. And it's probably just a matter of time that you cannot really keep patients like this on a ventilator for too long, because they will start to decompose and putrefy and whatnot. And and for that reason, we should really take them off the ventilator, either before or either with or without their organs, because we don't want to expose the families to the unsightly prospect and experience of seeing their loved ones decompose in front of their eyes. Not to mention what it would do to the hygiene of the hospital if we let these cadavers on ventilators for long periods of time. So essentially, the diagnosis of brain death became, as far as I'm concerned, a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the moment you make the declaration of brain death, then one of two things happen. Either you just disconnect the ventilator, or you take the body to the operating room for harvesting of the organs, at which point you have true death. And so there was no way to, seemingly no way to empirically refute the argument that the intensive care was masking the de facto disintegration of this body, until if a large collection of cases were collected by a physician named Alan Schumann, who collected a number of cases of patients who, for one reason or another, were declared brain dead, but they were not disposed of in the usual manner, meaning the ventilator was not disconnected. They were kept alive, and lo and behold, they did not decompose. They actually stayed alive, and in fact, Alan Schumann published the case of a child that was kept on a ventilator at home by his family for 24 years, with a diagnosis of after a diagnosis of brain death, and he published a collection of 200 or so patients, and that came to be known afterwards as the Schumann challenge, because he had empirical evidence that the initial argument was not all that sound. Now, some have argued that perhaps some of these patients that seem to have survived the diagnosis of brain death long term, maybe it was a misdiagnosis. Maybe there was sufficient brain activity to allow the integration to continue. But that clearly, I think, was disproved, at least to my satisfaction. For example, this young boy who survived, for 20 years, when he died, they did an autopsy, and the brain was actually liquefied. There was no brain substance at all in his skull at autopsy. And there were other cases like that where really the diagnosis of brain death was not really in question. It had been done sort of thoroughly, and flat EEG, flat. You can do metabolic scans of the brain, and there was no metabolic activity in the brain, that sort of thing. And yet patients seem to be able to survive the absence of a brain. So that created a problem for the argument from integration, to see that one can maintain integrity of the body. And Alan Schumann documented many physiologic phenomena of integrity, of undeniable integrity. For example, in this boy, the boy who survived till the age of 24 for 20 years as brain dead, went through puberty, right? So he and growth, right? So he grew. He was being fed. He was being fed by a feeding tube, but he was the kidneys were working, the liver was working. He was assimilating the food, growing as a body. And all of these are signs of integration. It was a single body. It was not, he did not decompose. And likewise, there are actually many women pregnant women who would have maybe a severe car accident, would have severe brain damage, would be determined to be brain dead, and then they'd be kept alive to save the fetus, so they'd be able to gestate a baby through pregnancy. Again, another sign of integration. These patients with brain death who are maintained on a ventilator can heal their wounds, can fight infection. So they show all signs of a fully integrated body empirically. So I think that created a big problem for those who were defending the argument from integration. At that point, there was no more any national debate, because the laws had been changed on the books. All states had sort of amended their legal definition of death to include death by neurological criteria. So the laws had been changed, and by then the debates were primarily academic in ethical journals, philosophical journals, etc. But nevertheless, it was disturbing enough that there had to be a different argument to defend the concept of brain death, and that argument was the argument that essentially the body, maybe it's an integrated body, maybe it is a body, but it's not human, right? And here too, again, very prominent Catholic ethicists and philosophers came to make that argument, including Griset himself, with his colleague, his natural law theory colleague Patrick Lee, published a paper in 2012, which is the subject of the second part of my paper, which I criticize their argument, where they argue that the body is not human, because it's so the argument is that it's not human because without a brain, it terminally lacks the capacity for rational thought, and therefore it is not apt, or it is not disposed for a rational soul, right? So that's the argument that they made, and they're not the only ones to have made it. Other prominent Thomists have made it. One is Benedict Ashley. In 2001, wrote a paper essentially arguing the same. So the argument from aptness, that a brain-dead body is not apt for a rational soul, and therefore cannot be considered human. And here they invoke a Thomistic principle that whenever you have a substance, the matter has to be proportionate to the soul, right? The body has to be proportionate to the soul, and that's the argument that seemed very compelling to me when I was, working on this topic and trying to understand it and try to come to my own conclusion. Because it is true that Thomas, time and again mentions that there has to be you cannot have, right? You cannot have, a tree is not apt to, for a human soul, right? I mean, the matter of a tree is a vegetative matter, and it's only apt for a vegetative soul. You cannot have, gold become fire, or gold. You cannot have stones start to speak or whatnot, right? There has to be, the matter has to be proportionate to the soul, and therefore, if the matter loses its is changed, in a significant way, right? Does that mean that the soul is, no longer, that it's no longer apt to receive that particular soul, and therefore does it mean that the substance is no longer the kind of substance that it was, and that a substantial change has occurred? And I think, so I think it's important to get that clear, that this is not... the fact that the matter is always proportionate to the soul is a correct philosophical argument, but whenever you see a particular substance, you cannot look at the matter of the you cannot point to the matter and say, look, the matter is not apt to being such and such substance, and therefore it is not such and such substance. It's not from looking at the matter that you make that determination. It's actually from looking at the substance itself, from looking at how the substance behave, and seeing that the substance behave as a substance of this particular kind does behave, that you make the determination that the matter must be apt. If the substance itself is this kind of a substance, then the matter must be apt to having this soul, or must be disposed to having this soul, right? So the dictum again is action follows being, right? So first you have to look at what you're dealing with, and then you determine, well, it is this kind of thing, and therefore its matter must be disposed to this particular kind of soul, or this particular kind of substantial form. And that's very important to do, because the point is that an irreversibly comatose body, so long as it remains a body, that it remains one thing, that it's there, maybe exactly how human bodies with a severe brain injury behave, right? As or any kind of sentient body, for that matter, even brain dead dogs would behave in the same way. That it's not that the fact that the substance has lost the exercise of one of its faculties, even if it's one of its essential faculties, does not mean that a substantial change has occurred, right? You have to sort of look at the substance itself and then judge. And in a way, what they're doing, they're begging the question when they say, this brain dead body is not apt to being informed by a human soul. Well, that's what they actually have to prove. They cannot just say that. They cannot say that just on the basis of the fact that the brain is damaged. So that's what maybe I want to draw your attention to that particular argument, just because it was taken up by by Thomistic philosophers, not only Benedict Ashley, but also William Wallace. William Wallace made the same, a similar defense of brain death, which I think is important to also discuss. William Wallace, and I think maybe many Thomistic philosophers who have argued that way, they've used the notion of Aristotelian embryology that was defended by Thomas, and the argument that Thomas made when he talks about embryology, when Thomas says that, when you have fertilization of an egg, it goes through stages, right? There's no Aquinas didn't believe in immediate hominization. That he thought that the matter had to develop and become well disposed to receiving a human soul, right? And it's not until it had the organs, like Aquinas didn't think in terms of organic development, or maybe he did, but not the way we do now. But the way this is translated with modern scientific knowledge is that, according to that theory, the matter had to of the baby would have to have at least the minimum organs necessary for to be well disposed to a human soul, to receiving a human soul. And there are some still to this day, I think, some Catholic philosophers. I mean, there was one by the name of Denisle. I think he died. He was a Belgian philosopher at Louvain who sort of argued, who defended this delayed hominization of the embryo. And so, likewise, William Wallace argued that at the end of life, you have the reverse that happens. You stop being human, right? The human soul leaves even before the body dies. And then the body becomes an animal, maybe an animal body, and then a vegetative body, and then it dies. It was kind of a shocking, reasoning and argument. But again, he did it using Thomistic authority, so to speak, using the same arguments that were made by Thomas for embryology, and therefore thinking that this is how you should think about applying hylomorphic principles to these questions. So I will leave it at that for now, and then maybe we can talk about it when we're face to face. In the last few minutes, maybe I'll talk about the heart and why I think it's actually important to argue that the criteria of having a pulse are important and are valid, meaning the criteria that the absence of a pulse is a valid criterion to determine that somebody is in fact dead. And that's because, again, many philosophers miss that. Even I'm finding people who are, should know better with Thomistic training. To be alive is to be a body that is self-moving. So there are two criteria. One criterion is to be a body, meaning to be integrated, and the other one is to be self-moving, right? So there has to be self-motion in the body. And there's no material part that can integrate. The integration comes from the soul. Only the soul can integrate a body, right? Only the substantial form of the body is the principle of integration of the body. But for the question of self-motion, there can be a part in the body that is the source of motion. And it's just unbelievable to me that Thomas Aquinas wrote a little book called De Motu Cordis, on the motion of the heart, that exactly explains that. It explains that in large animals, which, animals that have a heart and a cardiovascular system, the heart acts as the principle of motion in the body. And therefore, if there is clinical evidence, or even, it doesn't have to be a clinician who does that. You can see that, if there's no pulse in a body, if there's no self-motion, and if you think that it's not, it's irreversible, right? If sufficient time has lapsed or whatnot, then you can make a valid, a reasonable argument with moral certitude that the body is dead, not because it's not a body, but because it is not self-moving, right? Because the organ of self-motion is no longer functioning, right? The heart is dead. So once the heart is dead, doesn't beat, doesn't generate a pulse, then there's no possibility of self-motion inside the body. And so that's I think a point that is worth, because some people will say will say, well, they will say, okay, well, you cannot use neurological criteria for brain death, but then they will say, well, you can't use cardiac criteria either. They'll become sort of total skeptics. They'll say you can never tell that a person is really dead, and that's actually an argument that David Oderberg, some of you may know him. He's a prominent new Aristotelian Thomist in England. He published a paper not too long ago, I think last year, making that argument, saying that at the end of the day, the only way to know for sure that a body is dead is to actually see the decomposition, that you're not sure until you see the body decomposing. And I think he's missing the point. He's missing the point about the heart. At least in large animals, you can with moral certitude at least say that the body is dead if there is no pulse, if there's no actually signs of self-motion. And so that's I will leave it at that, and hopefully you'll have questions for me. I look forward to speaking with you in a few days. All right, bye-bye.